the mini-movie channel. Maelstrom Tales presents
The Fall of Lord Ashford.
A tale of betrayal, vengeance, and the sea.
Prologue. The year was 1672. The world was still learning what it meant to be divided into empires. Realms where a man's loyalty to a crown could mean the difference between a title and a rope around his neck. This is the story of Edward Ashford, 3rd Baron of Whitestone, a man who gave everything for his king, only to discover that loyalty is a commodity far less valuable than treachery. It is a story of the sea, of men bound by choice rather than blood, of how quickly a gentleman becomes a pirate when society decides he no longer deserves a gentleman's privileges. And it is a story that ends not with certainty, but with 3 possible truths, leaving it to the listener to decide which version of history actually occurred. Listen well, because legends, like truth, have a way of shifting depending on who tells them and when. Chapter 1. The Homecoming. The HMS Sovereign cut through the waters of the English Channel with the pride of a vessel that had served the Crown for 30 years. She was a third-rate frigate, not the largest warship in the Royal Navy, but sturdy, reliable, and feared in the waters where she sailed. Lord Edward Ashford stood at her bow, watching the grey English coastline emerge from the mist, like a memory returning to consciousness after a long sleep. 18 months. That was how long he had been away from England. 18 months commanding naval operations in the Caribbean, hunting Spanish merchants, defending British interests, doing exactly what the Crown had asked of him, with a competence that had earned him commendations, honours, and the respect of every officer who had served under him. But now it was over. His commission had ended. His orders had come. Return home, hand over command to Captain Edmund Reeves, and enjoy the peace and comfort that a loyal servant of the Crown deserved. Edward was 43 years old. He had never married, never had children. His entire life had been devoted to duty, first in military service, then in the governance of his estates when he was not at sea. He had sacrificed much for his position, for his honor, for the abstract concept of England that existed primarily in the minds of men who made decisions from comfortable rooms in distant cities. As the Sovereign approached Portsmouth, Edward made his way to the captain's cabin, technically his cabin for the duration of this final voyage, and changed from his naval uniform into the clothes of a lord. Fine wool, quality tailoring, the subtle insignia that marked him as a man of rank and substance. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the face looking back. Leaner than he remembered, sun-darkened, older certainly. But the eyes were still sharp, still capable of reading a situation and understanding what needed to be done. He did not know it yet, but those sharp eyes would serve him far better as a pirate than they ever had as an officer of the Crown. Chapter 2. The Betrayal. The carriage journey from Portsmouth to Whitestone took 2 days. The roads were muddy, the inns crude, and by the time Edward pulled up to the gates of his own estate, he was tired and eager for nothing more than a hot bath and a night in his own bed. The gates were locked. Not merely shut, but actually locked, with heavy iron chains and a padlock that looked new enough to shine in the afternoon light. For a moment, Edward simply stared at them, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, with a kind of deliberate calm that would become his defining characteristic in the trials to come, he dismounted from the carriage and approached the gatehouse. The old man who had guarded these gates for 20 years was gone. In his place stood a younger man, heavily muscled, with the look of someone hired more for his ability to use force than for any administrative skill. "I am Edward Ashford," said Edward simply. "Open the gates." The guard looked at him, this sun-darkened man in fine but travel-worn clothes. and laughed. "Lord Ashford is currently residing in London," said the guard with the kind of casual dismissal that comes from having been thoroughly briefed on his role. "He has no need of the country estate at present. I suggest you move along." "The current Lord Ashford," said Edward, his voice dropping slightly, "is standing in front of you. Now open these gates, or I will have them removed." The guard's expression shifted, not to obedience, but to something more dangerous. Pity mixed with contempt. "You might want to speak with Sir Marcus Whitmore," said the guard. "He's the one who authorized my posting here. He can explain the situation far better than I can." The name struck Edward like a physical blow. Marcus Whitmore, his oldest friend, the man who had been like a brother to him, who had stood beside him since their days at university, who had promised, explicitly promised, to oversee the Whitestone estate, while Edward was away serving the crown. It took Edward perhaps 5 minutes to convince the guard to send a messenger into the house. It took another hour for Marcus himself to emerge, and when he did, he was not alone. With him came 3 armed men and an expression of calculated sympathy that was somehow worse than any hostility could have been. Marcus was heavier than Edward remembered, softer around the middle, with the bloated look of a man who had been living well. His clothes were expensive, more expensive than Edward's own, and his manner was that of someone completely at ease with the situation. "Edward," he said, approaching with his hand extended as if this were merely a social call and not the destruction of everything Edward had worked for. "Thank God you're alive. We heard rumors that your ship had gone down off the Spanish coast. There was an incident." "The gates are locked," said Edward flatly. "My people are displaced. You are wearing authority in my house like it belongs to you. Explain yourself, Marcus, and choose your words carefully, because I am not in the mood for nonsense." Marcus's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. A moment of recognition, perhaps, that Edward was not the man he had been expecting to return. "Your estate is encumbered with debt," said Marcus carefully. "Significant debt, unpaid taxes, loans that came due, administrative costs that accumulated during your absence. I have been managing it as best I could. But the situation deteriorated. Eventually, I was forced to make a decision about the property's disposition." "The Crown paid my commission generously," said Edward. "I left instructions for the funds to be deposited in trust. There should be more than enough." "There was an accident," interrupted Marcus, 3 months ago. "A merchant vessel carrying the documentation of your accounts and the bulk of your deposits was lost to piracy. Completely lost. The funds were never recovered. The documentation was destroyed." Edward felt something shift inside him, that moment when reality fractures and the world he knew is no longer quite the same world he is standing in. "You are lying," he said quietly. "I am protecting what could be protected," replied Marcus. "The estate was forfeit, Edward. The Crown's tax agents were coming. I made a decision. An unauthorized decision, yes, but a necessary one. I purchased the property on behalf of a holding company. It kept it out of the Crown's hands. It kept it from being liquidated." "Who is the holding company?" "Me," said Marcus. "For now, once your affairs are settled, once we can prove your identity and re-establish your claim." "There is nothing more to say," interrupted Edward. He turned to leave. "Edward, wait!" called Marcus, and there was actual urgency in his voice now. "You cannot simply walk away from this. There are legal implications. The Crown has questions. There are suggestions that your absence was suspicious, that you may have conspired with foreign powers. You are currently..." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "You are currently considered a person of interest in an investigation." Edward stopped walking, but did not turn around. "What investigation?" "Into the loss of crown vessels," said Marcus, "and the diversion of naval funds. They think you may have been involved in selling information to the Spanish. They think you may have arranged the loss of the merchant ship carrying your accounts as cover. They want to question you." Now, Edward did turn around. "Then I shall answer their questions," he said. "At the Admiralty, in London, I have nothing to hide." "Edward," said Marcus, and now his voice carried genuine warning. "They do not want to question you at the Admiralty. The naval authorities have already concluded their investigation. The Crown's tax agents have decided to proceed with criminal charges. They are coming here. They are coming to arrest you." "For what crime?" "Treason," said Marcus simply. "Conspiracy with foreign powers, embezzlement of crown funds. They believe you orchestrated everything. The loss of the merchant vessel, the disappearance of your accounts, all of it. And the evidence they have." He trailed off. "Edward, the evidence is quite compelling. Forged documents, falsified reports. It all points to you." It took Edward a moment to understand what Marcus was saying. Then, with a clarity that was almost serene, he understood completely. Marcus had not merely stolen the estate. Marcus had constructed an elaborate lie that positioned Edward as a traitor to the crown. And now, with Edward returned and suddenly inconvenient, the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. "You did this," said Edward. Not a question, a statement of fact. "I did what was necessary," replied Marcus. "I gave you a choice, Edward. I have contacts in the naval office. I offered to help you disappear, to help you start a new life somewhere that the crown could not reach. The Americas, perhaps, or Africa. Somewhere where your past would not matter. And in exchange, you sign the estate over to me. Officially, legally, you disappear, and I inherit everything, not through fraud, but through a legitimate transfer from you. Edward, I am offering you your life." Edward looked at his oldest friend and felt something inside him calcify into something that was not quite hate, but was hate's closest cousin. "I am going to the Admiralty," he said, "and I am going to tell them exactly what you have done. And then, Marcus, I am going to take back what is mine, or I am going to die in the attempt." "Then you will die," said Marcus calmly, "because I have already filed the charges. The warrant is being prepared even now. By tonight, you will be wanted for treason, and the only person who can help you is me." For the first time, Edward smiled. "Then I suggest you prepare yourself," he said, "because I am not going to the Admiralty. I am going to the harbor, and I am going to take back the only thing that has ever truly belonged to me." He turned and walked away, back toward the carriage. Behind him, Marcus shouted something, but Edward did not hear it. His mind was already elsewhere, already on the water, already thinking about ships and tides, and the mathematics of escape. Chapter 3. The Sovereign's Choice. Portsmouth was a chaos of ship traffic, naval personnel, and the general hubbub of the most important military harbor in England. It took Edward 2 hours to reach the docks, avoiding the main streets where he might be recognized, moving through alleys and lesser-known paths that he had learned as a young man before duty had called him away. The HMS Sovereign sat at her moorings like a patient horse waiting for a rider who might never come. Captain Reeves was aboard, presumably overseeing the transition and the business of handing over command to his replacement. The crew was in a state of organized chaos. Some men preparing to leave service, others preparing for the next commission, still others simply waiting for their pay and their discharge papers. Edward made his way to the gangway and climbed aboard. No one stopped him. He was still, in the eyes of most sailors, their former commander, the man they had served under, the man they respected. He found Reeves in the captain's cabin, Edward's cabin technically, though only for this one final voyage. Captain Edmund Reeves was a good man, not brilliant, not terrible, simply competent in the way that most naval officers were. He looked up from the manifest he was reviewing and smiled. "Lord Ashford," he said, standing to greet Edward with the proper respect due to his rank. "I was expecting you. I have prepared all the necessary documentation for the transition. The ship is in excellent condition, and the crew is—" He paused, noting something in Edward's expression. "Is something the matter?" "The warrants have been filed," said Edward simply. "I am being charged with treason. By tomorrow at the latest, there will be soldiers here looking for me. I have perhaps a few hours before this port is locked down and my capture becomes inevitable." To his credit, Reeves did not immediately reach for a weapon or shout for the guard. Instead, he sat down slowly and looked at Edward with an expression of careful neutrality. "That is a serious matter," said Reeves finally. "It is a false matter," replied Edward. "I am innocent of the charges, but innocence means nothing if I remain in England and submit to a trial that has already been decided. I need a ship, Reeves. I need men, and I need to know if I can count on you." "You are asking me to commit treason," said Reeves quietly. "I am asking you to help me survive," corrected Edward. "What I do after that, what I become, that is my concern, not yours. But right now, I need options." Reeves stood and walked to the porthole, looking out at the harbor, at the other ships, at the soldiers moving along the docks. "There are perhaps 40 men aboard who would follow you without hesitation," he said finally. "Good men, experienced sailors. The rest would either stay loyal to the crown or remain neutral. I suspect if you tried to take this ship by force, you would encounter resistance." "I do not want to take this ship by force," said Edward. "I want to offer the men a choice. I want to tell them the truth, and I want to give them the opportunity to walk away without consequence. Those who choose to stay, they become part of something that the crown will define as piracy. And yet you are offering them this choice anyway," observed Reeves. "I am," agreed Edward, "because I have learned in the past few hours that honor means nothing. Justice means nothing. The only thing that matters is who has power and who does not. I am choosing to stand with those who choose to stand with me. The crown can define that however it wishes." Reeves turned back to face him. "I will help you," he said, "but not by becoming a pirate. I will help you by ensuring that this ship and her crew have the best possible chance of survival. Beyond that," he shrugged, "what happens after I step off this deck is no longer my responsibility." Together, they climbed to the main deck and called all hands to assemble. Within minutes, perhaps 80 men were standing before them. Sailors, officers, common crew, men from a dozen different ports and backgrounds, united only by their service aboard the Sovereign. Edward stood at the helm and told them the truth. He told them about Marcus, about the theft, about the false charges. He did not hide from them what he was proposing. He told them that accepting his offer meant becoming fugitives, possibly for the rest of their lives. "Those who wish to leave," said Edward, "may do so now. You will not face consequence. You will receive your wages in full. You will have Captain Reeves's word that he saw nothing, heard nothing, and that your loyalty remains unquestioned." Perhaps 30 men stepped forward. They took their discharge papers and climbed into the boats that Reeves had prepared. There was no shame in their choice, and Edward did not judge them. They were good men. They were simply men who had already given enough to chance and danger. Those who remained, roughly 45 sailors and officers, stood silently. "You understand," said Edward, "what you are committing to." "Yes, sir," replied one of them, a man named Thomas Hartley, who had been the Sovereign's master of the sails for 8 years. "We follow you, Lord Ashford. Wherever you sail, whatever you become, that is what we choose." A roar of agreement ran through the remaining men. "Then we sail in 1 hour," said Edward. "We leave this harbor before the warrants can be acted upon. And we do not stop sailing until England is too far behind us to hunt us anymore." Chapter 4. The Pursuit. The HMS Sovereign slipped out of Portsmouth Harbor on the evening tide, moving with the calculated grace of a ship whose crew knew her as intimately as they knew their own heartbeats. They had perhaps 8 hours of darkness. Enough time to put significant distance between themselves and the harbor, enough time to orient themselves toward open sea, where pursuit would become exponentially more difficult. But the Crown was faster than Edward had anticipated. A royal cutter, stationed at the mouth of the channel for exactly this kind of emergency, spotted them within 2 hours of departure. And unlike the merchant vessels and smaller ships that usually filled the channel, a cutter was fast, well-armed, and commanded by officers who understood exactly what it meant to pursue a ship that was now, by definition, operating outside the law. "They are signaling us to heave to," reported Thomas Hartley from his position at the helm. "Do not acknowledge the signal," said Edward. "Set all available canvas. I want every scrap of sail on this ship drawing wind." "They are firing," shouted another officer. A cannonball passed within 100 yards of the Sovereign's bow. A warning shot designed to demonstrate capability rather than to damage. "They will not sink us," said Edward calmly. "Not in home waters. Not with the possibility that they might capture us intact and drag us back to face trial. They will attempt to drive us toward shallower water, or to damage our masts and sails in ways that force us to surrender. Our job is to avoid both." What followed was a display of seamanship that would later be recorded in the logs of the pursuing cutter's commander as a masterclass in evasion. Edward had spent 18 months commanding naval operations in the Caribbean. He knew how to read wind and current, how to understand the capabilities and limitations of different ship designs, how to calculate angles and trajectories, and the mathematics of pursuit. The Sovereign moved through the darkness with the grace of a dancer, using the rocks and shallows of the English coast to her advantage. The cutter, heavier and less maneuverable, was forced again and again to adjust course to avoid running aground on hazards that the Sovereign's shallower draft allowed her to safely navigate. Twice the cutter's cannons fired. Once a shot struck the Sovereign's hull below the waterline, but it was not a mortal wound. Once a shot brought down part of the mizzen rigging, but the crew had it repaired within minutes. And then, as dawn broke over the channel, they saw it. Open water, the Atlantic, the vast, trackless, merciless ocean where a ship could disappear as completely as if it had never existed. "Full sail!" roared Edward. "I want every man on the rigging! We sail for the horizon!" The Sovereign accelerated under the weight of her canvas. Behind them, the cutter struggled to keep pace, but the gap was widening. By the time the sun had fully risen, the cutter had become nothing more than a distant speck, and then, not even that. Thomas Hartley appeared beside Edward at the helm. Exhaustion and exhilaration mixed in equal measure on his face. "We have done it, sir," he said. "We have escaped." Edward looked back at England. the white cliffs receding into the distance, the life he had known disappearing behind them like a dream upon waking. "We have not escaped," he said quietly. "We have simply begun a different kind of captivity. But at least this captivity is of our own choosing." Chapter 5. The First Battle. 3 days into the Atlantic, the first crisis came, not from pursuit, but from hunger. The Sovereign had been provisioned for a voyage to London, and then a handover of command. She was not provisioned for an indefinite flight into open ocean, with a crew of nearly 50 men who ate 3 meals a day and required fresh water to survive. "We have supplies for perhaps 2 weeks, reported the quartermaster, a thin, weathered man named Jonathan Cross. "After that, we face starvation unless we resupply." "There are merchant vessels throughout these waters," said Edward. "Spanish, Portuguese, French. We will take what we need." "That makes us pirates," said Cross, stating the fact as if it were merely an observation. "Yes," agreed Edward. "It does." The first merchant vessel they encountered was a small Spanish brig, riding low in the water, clearly heavily laden with cargo. She was perhaps 3 days out from port when the Sovereign spotted her and moved to intercept. Edward ordered the black flag raised, not out of malice but out of practicality. A merchant vessel flying the black flag had a simple choice: surrender or fight and likely die. Most chose surrender. This Spanish captain chose to fight. It was a mistake. The battle that followed lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The Spanish brig was carrying sugar, cocoa, and trade goods. She was not built for combat. Her cannons were merchant grade, poor quality, and mounted by men who were accustomed to fighting pirates, not naval warships. But the Spanish captain, a man named Diego Morales, fought with a kind of desperate courage, positioning his ship to rake the Sovereign's deck, accepting volleys from the English guns with a grim determination that bordered on suicidal. Edward, watching the battle unfold, began to understand something about himself that would define the rest of his life. He was a strategist and a tactician in ways that transcended the normal parameters of naval combat. He could read an opponent's intentions 3 moves ahead. He could see the moment when a victory became inevitable and press that advantage without mercy. He could also see when mercy was the more effective strategy. In this case, as the Spanish brig's mainmast shattered under the impact of a well-placed cannonball and the deck became covered in splinters and blood, Edward ordered his guns to cease fire. "Prepare to board," he commanded. "I want that ship taken intact and that captain alive. I want to understand why he chose to fight when surrender was his only viable option." Diego Morales was found in his cabin, having attempted to burn his own ship's cargo manifest in a last act of defiance. He was a small man, perhaps 60 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life at sea. When he saw Edward enter his cabin, followed by Thomas Hartley and 2 other officers, he straightened and looked directly at the English lord, without fear. "You are the captain of the English ship?" asked Morales in heavily accented English. "I am," said Edward. "Then you understand that I am bound to resist you," said Morales. "It is my duty to my king, my crew, and my honor to resist piracy." Edward studied the old Spaniard for a long moment. "Your cargo is mine now," he said finally. "Your ship I will burn after we transfer the supplies I need. Your crew I will offer the choice. Join us or be set ashore at the nearest port. Your life," he paused, "your life depends on your answer to a single question. Why did you choose to fight?" "Because capitulation is death," said Morales simply. "If I surrender without resistance, my family will be shamed. My king will order my execution for cowardice. My crew will be dispersed, likely impressed into service aboard Spanish warships or worse. But if I fight and lose, then at least I have preserved my honor. My crew might find sympathy among other sailors. My family might be shown mercy." Edward nodded slowly, understanding perfectly the calculus that had driven an old man to fight a superior force. "Your ship burns," said Edward, "but not immediately. You have time. Gather your crew. Recover what personal possessions you can. Prepare yourselves for the boats. We will carry you to the nearest port, Cape Verde, if the winds favor us. You will live, and you will tell the world that the English lord who took your ship did so with honor, that he fought your resistance and won, but did not butcher a man who chose to defend his duty." "And in exchange?" asked Morales shrewdly. "You never speak of my name," said Edward. "You never describe my ship in detail. You tell the world that you were attacked by Spanish pirates. You let my identity dissolve into rumor and uncertainty. Can you do that?" Morales smiled, a small, knowing smile that suggested he understood perfectly what Edward was doing. "I can," he said, "and I will. It is a fair exchange, Captain. For a man to die with his honor intact is worth almost any price." The Spanish brig burned that night, a pillar of flame against the darkness, visible for miles in any direction. But by the time any other ships might have seen it and investigated, the Sovereign was long gone, her holds filled with Spanish cargo, her crew reinforced by the knowledge that their captain was a man who valued honor, even in piracy. Chapter 6. The Legend Grows. What followed over the course of the next 6 months was a series of battles and captures that slowly transformed Edward Ashford from a fugitive English lord into something far more significant, a legend. Unlike traditional pirates, Edward never wasted lives unnecessarily. He never killed prisoners. He never destroyed ships for the simple pleasure of destruction. When he took a merchant vessel, he took the cargo that was necessary for survival and left the ship and crew largely intact to return to port and spread word of his deeds. The word that spread was not of a monster or a tyrant, but of a captain who fought with intelligence and restraint, who seemed to operate according to a code rather than simple greed, who treated his own crew with genuine respect rather than the iron cruelty that defined so many pirate captains. Tales began to circulate in the ports of the Caribbean, the English lord of the Sovereign who had gone to war against the crown itself, the captain who only fought when necessary and showed mercy when victory was assured, the man who paid his crew fairly and never sent them into battle without first explaining the strategy that might keep them alive. It made him, paradoxically, both more feared and more respected than crueler, more violent captains. Merchants began to offer their cargoes willingly rather than fight. Other pirates began to seek him out, wanting to serve under him, wanting to be part of the legend. But Edward understood, in a way that many pirate captains did not. That legend was a liability as much as an asset. The crown was hunting him with increasing intensity. Admiral Sir Geoffrey Hastings, one of the most capable naval commanders in the Royal Navy, had been given explicit orders to hunt Edward down and bring him back to England for trial and execution. So Edward did what a strategist always does. He moved his operations, gathered intelligence, planned several moves ahead, and waited for the moment when his enemy would make a mistake. Chapter 7. The Encounter at Tortuga. Tortuga was a haven for outlaws of every description. Pirates, privateers, escaped slaves, deserters from every navy in Europe. It was also where information flowed like rum, and where the threads of the world's violence and betrayal could be traced back to their sources. It was in a tavern called La Sirène Noire, the Black Mermaid, that Edward first learned about Catherine Delacroix. She was the daughter of a French merchant captain, captured during a raid by Barbary pirates and held for ransom. The ransom had never been paid. Instead, she had been held for nearly a year, waiting in a fortified compound on the coast of North Africa, a pawn in the games of men who valued nothing but profit and power. When Edward and his crew raided that very compound, not knowing that Catherine was there, simply having received intelligence that it held valuable cargo and weapons, they found her in a cell below the main fort, nearly dead from malnutrition and despair. She was perhaps 25 years old, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to contain all the suffering and resilience that the world could inflict upon a human being. When Edward's men broke open her cell and helped her to her feet, she looked at him with an expression of such profound disbelief that it took her several moments to accept that she was no longer a prisoner. "Who are you?" she asked in French, a language Edward spoke fluently from his naval service. "I am your liberation," he replied. "We are leaving this place immediately. We are taking you to safety." He carried her to the sovereign himself, not because he was trying to be gallant, but because she was too weak to walk, and he understood that these small acts of compassion were often what transformed a rescued person from a liability into a loyal member of a crew. Over the following weeks, as Catherine recovered her strength and her health, something began to happen between them. It was not the simple attraction of two lonely people finding comfort in each other's presence. It was something deeper, a recognition between two people who had both been betrayed by the world, and had somehow managed to survive the betrayal with their capacity for honor still intact. Catherine had been raised to be a merchant's daughter, to marry well, to secure advantageous trade alliances, to be essentially a commodity in the games that men played. But she had also been educated in the languages, cultures, and practices of the Mediterranean world. She had learned, through her captivity, that the world was neither as ordered nor as just as she had been taught to believe. When Edward found her standing at the rail of the Sovereign one evening, watching the sun set over the Caribbean, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. "I could take you back to France," he said, "to your family. They would welcome you. You would be safe." "Safe is a luxury that I have learned to distrust," she replied. "You could have simply left me in that compound, Edward, or ransomed me back to my father and taken the money. Instead, you chose to help me. Why? Because the world has enough men who make decisions based on profit," he said. "I do not wish to be one of them." She turned to face him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to contain something like understanding. "Then I will not leave," she said simply. "I will remain aboard the Sovereign, and I will see where this path leads. Because I suspect that whatever comes next will be far more interesting than returning to the life I was meant to live." Chapter 8. The Duel with... Chapter 8. The Duel with Hastings. But Paradise, if it could ever be called that, was fragile. Admiral Sir Geoffrey Hastings was not a man to accept failure. When his first pursuit of Edward had failed, he had simply adjusted his strategy. He had gathered intelligence, positioned his ships, and waited for Edward to make a mistake. The mistake came not from Edward, but from chance, that most reliable of forces in determining the fate of men at sea. A French merchant vessel, captured by Edward and added to his flotilla, turned out to be carrying papers that detailed not only the Sovereign's activities, but also her estimated position and scheduled movements. The merchant captain, a man Edward had trusted, turned out to be operating as an agent for the Spanish crown, sending regular reports to colonial authorities. When the papers were discovered, it was too late to prevent the intelligence from reaching Admiral Hastings. and Hastings, reading through the documentation of Edward's movements over the past 6 months, began to calculate where the sovereign was likely to be at a specific point in the future. He was correct. The HMS Vanguard, Hastings's flagship, a heavy 60-gun ship of the line, encountered the sovereign off the coast of Jamaica on a clear morning when the sea was calm and the sky seemed to promise nothing but a day like any other. The battle that followed was perhaps the finest display of naval tactics the Caribbean had ever witnessed. The Vanguard, larger and more heavily armed, had every mathematical advantage. In a straightforward engagement, she would pound the sovereign into submission within an hour. Hastings was counting on exactly that. But Edward was not interested in straightforward engagements. Using the shallow waters off the Jamaican coast, exploiting tide tables and his intimate knowledge of reefs and currents, Edward maneuvered the sovereign in ways that the larger ship simply could not match. He would engage, then withdraw to waters too shallow for the Vanguard to follow. He would circle back and rake the Vanguard's stern with cannon fire, then disappear again before Hastings could organize a response. It was not a traditional battle. It was, rather, a demonstration of the vast gulf between a man who understood naval combat as an abstract, mathematical problem, and a man who understood it as an art form requiring equal parts logic, intuition, and courage. When Hastings finally realized that he had been outmaneuvered, that the sovereign had actually inflicted more damage to the Vanguard than the reverse, and that his ship was beginning to take on water, he made a decision that would define the rest of the war between them. He surrendered. Not formally, not without a final volley of protest. But he broke off the engagement and limped back toward Jamaica, acknowledging through his actions that he had been defeated by a ship and captain that should not have been capable of defeating him. Edward did not pursue. He simply watched as the Vanguard withdrew, and then he called his crew to order and made a declaration. "We have defeated the Royal Navy of England," he said. "We have proven that a ship commanded by honor and strategy is more than a match for a ship commanded by mere force and crown authority. But we have also drawn the attention of every navy in the world. From this moment forward, we are no longer simply pirates. We are the most wanted men in Christendom." He paused, looking at Catherine, who stood beside him at the helm with the bearing of someone who had become, entirely by choice, a pirate queen. "Those of you who wish to leave," he said, "may do so at the next port. No shame, no judgment, but those who remain, those who stay with me, must understand that we have set ourselves on a path from which there may be no return. The price of victory is that the world will never stop hunting us. The price of freedom is that we can never truly be free, in the way we once understood freedom." Not a single man stepped forward, and in the silence that followed, Edward understood that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer a lord. He was no longer even a fugitive. He was a legend, for better and for worse. Chapter 9. The Final Days. What happened next depends entirely on which version of the story you choose to believe. For 6 more months, the Sovereign and her crew dominated the Caribbean. They took merchant vessels, Spanish naval ships, Portuguese traders. They fought with anyone who opposed them and showed mercy to those who did not threaten them. Edward's reputation grew until he was spoken of in the same breath as the greatest pirate captains in history. Men like Blackbeard and Morgan, though Edward's methods were more strategic and far less brutal. But all legends must eventually end. All stories must find their conclusion, even if that conclusion is ambiguous. There came a day, the exact date is lost to history, when the Sovereign sailed into a thick fog off the coast of a small, uncharted island. When the fog lifted, she was gone. No one knows for certain what happened. Version 1. The Reckoning. In this telling, the HMS Vanguard and 2 other royal warships found the Sovereign hidden in a coastal inlet. A battle ensued, a final desperate engagement where Edward and his crew fought, knowing that capture meant execution and defeat meant death. The Sovereign's guns blazed until they ran out of ammunition. Her crew fought with cutlasses and pistols until they could no longer stand, and in the end, she sank, either struck by cannon fire or deliberately scuttled by Edward to deny the crown the pleasure of parading her through English ports as a trophy. In this version, Edward died with his ship, going down with her to the bottom of the sea, his body never recovered, his final moments unknown. Catherine died beside him, choosing death with honor over a lifetime of captivity. The Vanguard returned to port claiming victory, though the loss of 3 ships and hundreds of men seemed a steep price for a single merchant vessel and a handful of pirates. In this telling, Edward becomes a martyr, the lord who defied the crown and died, rather than submit. His legend becomes immortal precisely because his ending is tragic and uncertain. Version 2: The Escape. In this telling, the Sovereign did not encounter any naval vessels, instead guided by intelligence that the crown's hunters were closing in. Edward made a deliberate decision. After 6 months of piracy, he had accumulated sufficient wealth to purchase a new identity. He had already established contacts with merchants and officials in the Far East who were willing to overlook a man's past for the right price. The Sovereign sailed not toward the Caribbean havens, but away from them entirely, out into the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, toward the trading ports of Southeast Asia. There, using forged papers and carefully constructed identities, Edward and his crew, including Catherine, began the process of becoming ordinary people. Merchants, traders, small-town administrators, men and women who had once commanded ships and lived by the code of piracy, slowly transformed into people who lived by the code of commerce and commerce alone. Edward purchased a plantation on a small island. Not a grand estate like the one Marcus Whitmore had stolen, but something modest, something that allowed him to live comfortably without drawing attention to himself. Catherine married him, not in a grand ceremony, but in a small private affair witnessed only by his most trusted crew members. They had a child together, a daughter by some accounts, or a son, depending on which tavern tale you believed. And as the years passed, the legend of the English lord faded into myth. Few people remembered his name. Fewer still connected the quiet merchant living on a remote island to the legendary pirate who had defied the crown. In this telling, Edward's greatest victory is not that he defeated the Royal Navy, but that he escaped history entirely. He became unknown. He became invisible. He achieved the one thing that no pirate captain ever achieves. He lived a long, quiet life. Version 3: The Ambiguity. And in the third telling, the one that sailors still tell in the taverns of every port in the world, both versions are true, and both are false. The Sovereign did sail into a fog and did not sail out of it. What happened in that fog remains unknown. Perhaps there was a battle. Perhaps there was an escape. Perhaps something else entirely. Some act of God or nature that the men who lived it could not adequately explain, so they invented versions that made sense. Thomas Hartley, who sailed with Edward for 3 years before disappearing, was reported to have been seen in Singapore, then in Calcutta, then in Port Royal, sitting in a tavern and telling stories about a captain who had outsmarted the entire Royal Navy, with nothing more than his wits and the loyalty of his men. Catherine Delacroix was never seen again. No records of her death exist in any port in Christendom, but occasionally, in the most remote trading posts of the East Indies, there were reports of a European woman running a plantation, speaking multiple languages. living with a man of considerable, quiet authority. The sovereign herself was never found. No wrecks matching her description ever washed up on any known shore. Her hulk never became a reef or a cautionary tale. She simply vanished from the world as completely as her captain did. And so the legend persists, not as a story with a clear ending, but as a story that cannot end, because ending it would destroy the possibility of it being true. So long as the fate of the sovereign remains unknown, so long as the truth remains obscured by fog and rumor, the legend survives. And in that survival, it becomes more powerful than any historical fact could ever be. Epilogue: The Tavern Keeper's Tale. 50 years later, in a tavern in Port Royal that specialized in stories as much as it specialized in rum, an old man sat nursing a drink and telling anyone who would listen about the English lord who had defied the crown. "I knew him," said the old man, and it was impossible to tell from his voice whether he was telling the truth, or had simply absorbed the legend so completely that truth and fiction had become indistinguishable in his mind. "I sailed with Edward Ashford aboard the Sovereign. I was part of his crew when we took that Spanish brig. I was there when we fought Hastings and sent him limping back to Jamaica." "What happened to him?" someone in the crowd inevitably asked. The old man smiled, a small, knowing smile that suggested he held a secret that he had no intention of revealing. "He became what he needed to become," said the old man. "He was a lord, then he was a fugitive, then he was a pirate, then he was a legend, and in the end, he was simply a man who had learned that freedom means different things to different people, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not winning, but choosing to stop fighting." He raised his cup in a silent toast to a ghost, and the tavern fell silent, the way taverns do when someone speaks a truth that transcends the normal parameters of conversation. "Somewhere," continued the old man, "there is an island that does not appear on any map, and on that island there are people living lives of perfect, ordinary contentment. And if you were to ask them if they knew anything about a ship called the Sovereign, or a captain named Edward Ashford, they would simply smile and say they had never heard of such things." "Do you believe he lived?" asked a young sailor. "I believe," said the old man carefully, "that a man who loved honor more than power, who loved honor more than life itself, is precisely the kind of man who would choose to disappear rather than become a monster the world was demanding he become. Whether that man was Edward Ashford, or whether he was simply a legend given form and substance by the needs of tired men to believe that defiance is possible, that may be the same question. He drank, and in the drinking, the conversation was over. The legend persisted. The truth remained hidden, and somewhere in a place that existed more in the hearts of men than on any map, the Sovereign still sailed on, commanded by a captain who chose honor over everything else, carrying a crew of men who had learned that freedom and loyalty are not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The end.